The morning mist clung to the Normandy coastline like a shroud, obscuring what would become the most decisive demonstration of industrial warfare in human history. At precisely 5 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen raised his Zeiss binoculars to scan the English Channel from his concrete observation post atop Crisbecq battery. What he witnessed through that pre-dawn gloom would haunt him for the rest of his life and shatter every assumption the German military had held about their enemy's capabilities. Through the lifting fog emerged an impossible sight: the English Channel. That protective moat which had shielded the Third Reich's western flank for 4 years had transformed overnight into a steel highway stretching from horizon to horizon. Ships everywhere, as far as the eye could see, their dark silhouettes merging into one continuous mass of approaching industrial might. This was not merely an invasion fleet. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had assured him could never exist. In that moment of terrible clarity, Ohmsen realized he was witnessing something far beyond a military operation. He was seeing the future of warfare itself, where industrial mathematics would trump tactical brilliance, where production capacity would determine victory more than courage or strategy. The 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German defender to cite what military historians would later recognize as the moment when traditional warfare died and industrial warfare was born. What Ohmsen saw through his rangefinder that morning represented more than 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels, crewed by over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 allied nations. But the true shock wasn't in the numbers themselves. It was in what those numbers revealed about American industrial capabilities that German intelligence had catastrophically underestimated. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary story of industrial might meeting military tradition, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy this kind of historical documentary content, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from around the world. Now, let's return to that fateful morning when the mathematics of modern warfare became terrifyingly clear. The German High Command had built their entire defensive strategy on fundamentally flawed assumptions about Allied capabilities. For months, they had convinced themselves that the Allies might mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions, supported by maybe 3,000 vessels. Calculations based on their own limitations, their own experience of scarcity, and their own increasingly exhausted industrial base. After 5 years of total war, German planners projected their own resource constraints onto their enemies, a fatal error that would cost them everything. As dawn broke across the Norman coast on June 6, German observers in bunkers and observation posts from Cherbourg to Le Havre began reporting the impossible. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. Not a raid or feint, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The scale defied comprehension: more vessels than had ever been assembled for a single military operation, representing industrial capacity on a level that challenged the German understanding of what was possible. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. These were professional soldiers who had conquered most of Europe, veterans of campaigns across Poland, France, the Low Countries, and Russia. They understood military logistics, supply chains, and the immense complexity of amphibious operations. What they witnessed that morning wasn't just numerically superior, it represented a completely different order of magnitude, a demonstration of industrial warfare that made their professional expertise suddenly obsolete. At Strong Point WN-62, overlooking what would become known as Omaha Beach, Jeff Ryder, Heinrich Severloh, peered through his machine gun embrasure at 5:45 a.m. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen had never seen the ocean before being stationed in Normandy. Now, as he later wrote in his memoir, he saw no ocean at Olanley Steel. Ships everywhere, he recalled. Big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count, but gave up at 100. There were thousands. This moment of recognition spread across the entire 50-mile invasion front as German officers and soldiers experienced the same stunning realization. They weren't facing merely superior numbers. They were confronting a fundamentally different approach to warfare itself. While German military doctrine emphasized tactical excellence, individual heroism, and efficient use of limited resources, the Americans had arrived with something far more devastating: the full industrial capacity of a continental democracy unleashed for military purposes. The German military mind, trained in the Prussian tradition of tactical brilliance, overcoming material disadvantages, simply couldn't process what they were seeing. General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had spent months inspecting these very fortifications, convinced that the Atlantic Wall could repel any invasion through superior positioning and defensive strategy. The sight of nearly 7,000 Allied vessels rendered such calculations meaningless. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, appointed as naval advisor to Rommel in November 1943, had pressed for more mines, more obstacles, more coastal artillery. Born into a naval family in 1894, Ruge understood maritime operations better than any German officer in France. But as he would later write in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, they had been preparing to fight the last war while the enemy was bringing the next one. The fundamental misunderstanding ran deeper than mere numbers. German strategic thinking remained rooted in European-style warfare, where armies fought with carefully hoarded resources, where every tank, every aircraft, every round of ammunition was precious and irreplaceable. The American approach to D-Day represented something entirely different: industrial abundance, applied to military problems with a lavishness that bordered on the incomprehensible. As Ohmsen's battery received the order to open fire at 5:52 a.m., he understood with crystal clarity that his guns, his training, his courage, none of it mattered. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from his check-made Kota cannons arced toward the invasion fleet. It was, as he later described it, like throwing drops of water against an approaching tsunami. His battery engaged the USS Tuscaloosa, USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada, claiming only the destroyer USS Coria, only American destroyer, lost on D-Day. For every ship they hit, hundreds passed unharmed. But the true revelation was yet to come. The Germans had prepared for an invasion. They had not prepared for the industrial avalanche that would bury them under sheer material superiority. The statistics that would emerge from D-Day would not just represent military defeat. They would document the moment when industrial capacity became the primary determinant of military victory, fundamentally changing the nature of warfare itself. As reports flooded into German headquarters throughout the morning, a pattern emerged that would reshape military thinking for generations. This was unjust about having more ships or more men. It was about having so many that individual losses became statistically irrelevant. When the USS Cory was lost, other destroyers immediately took its place. Ships weren't precious, irreplaceable assets, as they were for the Kriegsmarine. They were tools, and America had thousands more in reserve. The night of June 5th had brought ominous signs that German intelligence completely misinterpreted. At Army Group B headquarters in La Rosigion, 50 miles from the coast, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rommel, monitored increasingly disturbing reports of Allied activity. Rommel himself was absent, celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany. Convinced the weather was too poor for any invasion attempt, a miscalculation that would prove costly beyond measure. At 1:20 a.m., the German 7th Army received notification of massive parachute drops across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, numbering over 13,000 men, were being delivered by Douglas C-47 Skytrains in what should have been recognized as the opening phase of the main invasion. Instead, German commanders interpreted these drops as diversionary raids, failing to grasp the scale of coordination required for such operations. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lay, possessed the tactical instinct that years of combat had honed to a razor's edge. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx understood immediately that something unprecedented was unfolding. Yet even he, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, could not imagine the true scale of what was approaching the Norman coast. The German defenders had spent years preparing for an invasion, constructing the Atlantic walls, massive fortifications, training for amphibious assault scenarios, and positioning their limited reserves for maximum effect. What they had unprepared for was an enemy that could simply overwhelm their defensive calculations through sheer industrial abundance. The mathematical reality of American production capacity was about to collide with German tactical doctrine in the most devastating way possible. As the first light of dawn crept across the Normandy coast, the true magnitude of German intelligence failure became apparent. The elaborate deception of Operation Fortitude had convinced German intelligence that any Normandy landings would be a feint, with the real invasion coming at Pas-de-Calais, under Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. This miscalculation would keep crucial German reserves frozen for weeks, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the real one succeeded beyond all Allied expectations. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove far more than a military victory or defeat. D-Day would demonstrate that in the age of industrial warfare, traditional military virtues, tactical brilliance, superior training could be rendered irrelevant by overwhelming material superiority. The German officers who witnessed the approaching armada were about to learn that they were fighting not just an enemy army, but the full industrial capacity of the United States, and nothing in their professional experience had prepared them for what that truly meant. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment commenced, and with it began the most comprehensive demonstration of industrial warfare in human history. The statistics alone told a story that would reshape military thinking for generations to come. Available to the Allied fleet were 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors, a concentration of naval firepower that dwarfed anything the German defenders had imagined possible. For the German defenders positioned along the Atlantic Wall, this was their first brutal lesson in American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour of bombardment. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds, meaning that in 60 minutes, a single ship had delivered 178 tons of high explosives, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in their total ammunition reserves. The psychological impact of this bombardment extended far beyond its immediate destructive effects. German officers, trained in the careful conservation of ammunition that had characterized European warfare for centuries, watched in stunned disbelief as the Americans expended more ordnance in the first hour than some German divisions had fired in entire campaigns. This was warfare as they understood it. This was industrial capacity applied to military problems with a lavishness that bordered on the incomprehensible. Before the first soldier set foot on the beaches, the Allied naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 shells from cruisers, and 3,500 shells from battleships. The total expenditure, roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance, represented more firepower than the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy could bring to bear. General der Infanterie Wenther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief West, would later testify to Allied interrogators. "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories, but the naval bombardment was merely the prelude to an even more devastating demonstration of Allied industrial superiority." At 6 a.m., as shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall's fortifications, German defenders witnessed something that defied their understanding of air power. The sky filled with aircraft, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands, their engines creating a continuous thunder that drowned out even the naval gunfire. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landings, having secured complete air supremacy in the months prior to the invasion. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had approximately 300 operational aircraft in all of France. On D-Day itself, they managed just 319 sorties against the Allied invasion force. The mathematics weren't just unfavorable, they were absurd. For every German aircraft in the air, there were 46 Allied planes. Major Joseph Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, made the Luftwaffe's only meaningful attack on the invasion beaches that morning. Flying with just his wingman, Heinz Waterchick, he strafed Sword Beach once before, fleeing from dozens of Allied fighters. This pathetic response, documented in multiple historical accounts, demonstrated the complete impotence of German air power in the face of overwhelming Allied industrial capacity. The variety and sophistication of Allied aircraft particularly impressed German observers who survived the war to write their memoirs. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, Typhoons, B-26 Marauders, B-24 Liberators, specialized aircraft designed for specific tactical roles. each representing thousands of hours of engineering development and mass production techniques that Germany could no longer match. Despite the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them, German defenders, at certain positions, initially believed they might hold their ground through superior positioning and tactical skill. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions on bluffs overlooking the landing zones. Their machine guns in concrete bunkers created interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing zone. The first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions walked into what seemed like certain slaughter. Heinrich Severloh, manning an MG-42 machine gun at Widerstands Nest 62, fired over 12,000 rounds that morning, a documented fact from his own post-war testimony. He watched American soldiers fall by the dozens, by the hundreds. Bodies floated in the surf as the beach turned red with blood. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might hold against even this unprecedented assault. The German defenders' initial success at Omaha Beach represented everything their military doctrine had taught them about warfare: superior positioning, overlapping fields of fire, and tactical excellence could overcome even significant numerical disadvantages. For a few hours, it appeared their professional expertise might triumph over American industrial might. Then something unprecedented occurred that would shatter these illusions forever. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach critical and General Omar Bradley considering evacuation of the landing force, American naval commanders made a decision that perfectly exemplified their approach to industrial warfare. Ignoring the risks of grounding or mines, destroyers closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach point-blank range for naval guns. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints with devastating accuracy. At such close range, they couldn't miss. This action, well documented in naval records, proved decisive in breaking the German defense at Omaha Beach. But more importantly, it demonstrated something that German officers were only beginning to understand about American military philosophy. This was the moment German military thinking began to grasp the true meaning of American industrial might. It wasn't just the number of ships, it was the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable assets in pursuit of tactical objectives. When the destroyer USS Corey was lost to German shore batteries, other vessels immediately moved to take its place. Ships were not precious, irreplaceable assets, as they were for the Kriegsmarine. They were tools in an industrial process, and America had thousands more. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. German naval doctrine, forged in the crucible of limited resources and careful conservation of assets, suddenly seemed primitive compared to American industrial abundance. The sight of destroyers deliberately exposing themselves to shore fire, knowing they could be replaced if lost, represented a fundamental shift in military thinking that the Germans were unprepared to counter. As the morning progressed, German observers witnessed something that defied their understanding of amphibious operations on the most basic level. The landing craft kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of men and materiel flowing from sea to shore. The variety of specialized vessels particularly stunned German defenders who had expected conventional landing boats and perhaps a few improvised craft. Landing craft tank LCTs disgorged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches, their bow ramps dropping to create instant bridges from sea to land. The German military mind, trained in European-style warfare, where every vehicle was precious and specialized equipment was scarce, simply couldn't process this demonstration of industrial abundance applied to tactical problems. They had prepared for an invasion force that would struggle with basic logistics, that would need to capture ports quickly to sustain their advance. Instead, they witnessed an enemy that had eliminated logistical constraints through sheer industrial overkill. By nightfall of June 6th, the statistics told a story that would reshape military theory for generations. The Allies had successfully landed approximately 156,000 troops, 132,715 by sea, and 23,400 airborne forces. This force alone exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending the Normandy region. In the first 24 hours, the documented Allied achievement included not just personnel, but the industrial output of an entire continental democracy: 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The comparison with German capabilities was devastating. The entire German 7th Army defending Normandy possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies had landed more than 3 times that number on the first day alone, and this was merely the beginning of a logistical pipeline that stretched back across the Atlantic to American factories still operating at full capacity. The German response to the invasion revealed not just material inferiority, but systemic breakdown in the face of overwhelming enemy capability. The legendary panzer divisions that had conquered France in 6 weeks during 1940 found themselves paralyzed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to intervene on D-Day, began its counterattack at 4 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the initial landings. What should have been a devastating armored thrust became instead a tragic procession of burning vehicles. The division took 3 full hours to move just 10 miles from Cannes through Allied air attacks, a distance that should have taken 30 minutes in peacetime. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered something entirely new in their experience: naval gunfire, directed by forward observers with radio communication to ships lying 15 miles offshore. HMS Warspite, monitoring German radio communications from her position in the channel, fired 15-inch shells that could penetrate any tank ever built. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later write in his memoirs about this encounter. The enemy's material superiority was so overwhelming that our own strength was swept away like a wave breaking on a rock. We were not fighting an army, we were fighting an industrial system. This realization that they were confronting not just superior numbers, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare began to dawn on German commanders across the entire front. Traditional military virtues that had served them well in earlier campaigns: tactical flexibility, individual initiative, efficient use of limited resources, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming material abundance. The night of June 6th brought no respite for German forces, only a growing understanding of their hopeless situation. Intelligence reports confirmed what frontline observers had been witnessing all days was no diversionary attack or limited operation, but the main Allied invasion, supported by industrial capacity on a scale that defied comprehension. The mathematics of modern warfare had shifted decisively against them, and there would be no tactical brilliance sufficient to overcome such material disadvantages. On June 7th, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The intelligence seemed impossible, contradicting every assumption about the limitations of amphibious warfare. The Allies weren't just capturing existing ports to supply their invasion, they were constructing entirely new harbors from nothing, building them in the open sea with an industrial capability that challenged German comprehension of what was possible in modern warfare. The Mulberry harbors represented the pinnacle of Allied industrial planning and execution, prefabricated in Britain over months of secret preparation. These artificial ports consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete components, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 ships deliberately sunk as break. The scale of engineering and logistics required for such an undertaking dwarfed anything in German military experience. Within just 2 weeks of D-Day, the Mulberry harbors were handling 9,000 tons of supplies, daily more cargo capacity than many established French ports that the Germans had spent 4 years fortifying. The psychological impact on German commanders was devastating. They had constructed the Atlantic Wall specifically to protect existing ports, understanding that any invasion force would need harbor facilities to sustain extended operations. The Americans had simply eliminated this requirement through industrial engineering on an unprecedented scale. General der Panzertruppe, Leo Freiherr Gehr von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzergroup West, discovered the true extent of Allied deception when captured documents revealed General Patton's actual location in Normandy, commanding the very real Third Army rather than the fictitious force that German intelligence believed was preparing for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. For crucial weeks, German reserves had remained frozen, waiting for an attack that would never come, while the actual invasion succeeded beyond all expectations. As June progressed into July, German officers' reports to higher headquarters became increasingly desperate in tone. The professional language of military briefings could barely contain their growing realization that they were confronting something beyond traditional military defeat. This was systemic collapse in the face of industrial capacity that rendered their expertise obsolete. General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received an increasingly frantic telephone call from General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW headquarters, demanding to know why the invasion hadn't been thrown back into the sea as Rommel had promised. When Keitel asked what should be done about the deteriorating situation, Rundstedt delivered his famously blunt response, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" For this moment of honesty about Germany's hopeless strategic position, Rundstedt was immediately relieved of command. The Nazi leadership's inability to acknowledge reality, even when presented with overwhelming evidence of their industrial inferiority, would prove characteristic of their response to the unfolding catastrophe in Normandy. Rommel himself met with Hitler on June 17 at Margeville, France, in what would prove to be one of their final conferences. According to documented accounts from surviving staff officers, Rommel presented detailed statistics showing the hopelessness of the German position, complete Allied air supremacy with aircraft ratios of 40-1, German divisions reduced to 30% of authorized strength, and the complete impossibility of daylight movement due to naval gunfire that could reach targets 20 miles inland. Hitler's response perfectly illustrated the disconnect between Nazi ideology and military reality. Rather than acknowledging the industrial mathematics that made German defeat inevitable, he forbade any retreat and demanded fanatical resistance that would only increase German casualties without affecting the ultimate outcome. Rommel left the meeting knowing that Germany was doomed, understanding that continued resistance would serve no purpose except to prolong the suffering of German soldiers and French civilians. Within a month of this meeting, Rommel would be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler and forced to commit suicide. His chief of staff, Hans Speidel, who survived the war to become a NATO general, would later write in Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy campaign, "We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were buried under an avalanche of material that made our professional skills irrelevant." The battle for Cannes demonstrated the complete futility of German resistance against Allied material superiority in the starkest possible terms. On July 7th, 467 RAF heavy bombers dropped 2,500 tons of bombs on the ancient Norman city in just 40 minutes, more explosive power than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The psychological impact of this demonstration extended far beyond its immediate tactical effects. German soldiers who survived this bombardment described the experience in terms that revealed how completely it had shattered their understanding of warfare. The earth itself seemed to liquefy under the impact of such concentrated explosive force. Buildings that had stood for centuries simply vanished, vaporized by the industrial capacity of Allied bombing. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler-Jugend, considered one of Germany's elite units, entered the Normandy battle with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks of combat, it had been reduced to 300 men with no operational armor, losing 8,000 soldiers in the Falaise pocket alone. The transformation of warfare from a contest of military skill to an industrial equation became most apparent during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, beginning July 25. This operation provided the final, definitive demonstration of Allied industrial supremacy that would forever change how military professionals understood the nature of modern warfare. The statistics alone told the story of this transformation. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 3,300 tons of ordnance in a concentrated carpet-bombing attack targeting an area measuring just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. The density of explosive force applied to such a small area had never been achieved in military history, representing industrial overkill on a scale that defied traditional military logic. General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzerlehr Division positioned directly under this bombardment, reported to Army Group B headquarters, "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting an industrial complex that can afford to expend more ordnance in 1 hour than we possess in our entire inventory." The Panzerlehr Division, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, simply vanished as a fighting unit. Of 3,000 men in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly, 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were so psychologically shattered that they could no longer function as soldiers. The division's combat effectiveness dropped to zero, not through tactical defeat, but through the simple application of overwhelming industrial force. The operation's tragic friendly fire incidents, which killed 111 Americans, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNear, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in action in the European theater, were absorbed without affecting the operation's success. This acceptance of casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives demonstrated another aspect of industrial warfare that German commanders found difficult to comprehend: the willingness to sustain losses that would have crippled smaller forces. The Falaise Pocket, from August 12 to 21, 1944, became the final demonstration of what happened when traditional military forces encountered the full industrial capacity of modern democratic nations. The documented statistics read like an apocalyptic inventory: 10,000 to 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed in the northern sector alone, 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles abandoned, and 252 artillery pieces lost. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans managed to escape the encirclement, but as disorganized remnants rather than coherent fighting units. The German General Staff, trained in the careful preservation of military assets, struggled to comprehend that they were witnessing not a military defeat, but an industrial equation. Their forces hadn't been outfought, they had been mathematically eliminated. The 1944 production statistics starkly illustrated the scale of Allied industrial dominance that made German resistance ultimately futile. German aircraft production for the entire year: 39,807 planes. American production for the same period: 96,000 aircraft, not including British, Canadian, or Soviet manufacturing. Perhaps most telling was the comparison in military truck production, the foundation of modern logistics. Germany produced 68,000 military trucks in 1944, while America manufactured 650,000, nearly 10 times German production. These vehicles represented more than mere transportation. They embodied the industrial capacity to sustain military operations on a global scale that Germany simply could not match. The total American wartime production figures documented the complete industrial mobilization of a continental democracy: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, calculated after the war that by 1944 the Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5 to 1. In certain categories, like military vehicles, the ratio reached 10 to 1. We were not defeated militarily, Halder concluded in his post-war analysis. We were mathematically eliminated by industrial capacity we never understood and could never match. The German officers who survived Normandy underwent a psychological transformation that extended far beyond military defeat. They had witnessed not just the failure of their armies, but the complete invalidation of Nazi ideology regarding German superiority and American industrial weakness. Young officers who had grown up under Nazism were particularly affected, having been indoctrinated with beliefs about American softness and industrial inadequacy that the Normandy campaign had utterly destroyed. Instead of the spoiled, luxury-weakened Americans that Nazi propaganda had described, German soldiers encountered opponents who possessed machines to do the hard work, radios for perfect coordination, abundant ammunition for constant practice, and unshakable confidence derived from unlimited logistical support. The stereotype of American military incompetence crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence of industrial and organizational superiority. The suicide rate among German officers spiked dramatically during and after the Normandy campaign, reflecting not just military defeat but the psychological trauma of worldview collapse. These were professional soldiers whose entire understanding of warfare, national strength, and their own competence had been invalidated by what they witnessed. Defeat in battle was comprehensible. The complete irrelevance of their professional expertise was devastating. Beyond mere quantity, German officers confronted technological gaps that revealed how far behind their industrial base had fallen. Proximity fuses turned Allied anti-aircraft fire into precision weapons that German gunners couldn't match. Radar-directed naval gunfire could hit targets 20 miles inland with first-round accuracy that seemed impossible to defenders who had never experienced such precision. DUKW amphibious trucks solved logistical problems that German quartermasters couldn't even conceptualize. Swimming ashore and driving directly to supply dumps with loads that would have required complex ship-to-shore transfer operations. The Allied use of specialized engineering vehicles particularly impressed German officers who survived to write their memoirs. Hobart's funnies modified tanks that could clear minefields, lay bridges, and destroy bunker-solved tactical problems through industrial engineering rather than heroic sacrifice. German doctrine emphasized individual courage and tactical brilliance to overcome material obstacles. American doctrine eliminated obstacles through superior technology and overwhelming firepower. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German officers developed a particular psychological dread of Allied naval gunfire that extended beyond its immediate destructive effects. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns could fire 2,048-pound shells 23 miles inland, turning any visible target into instant destruction. The USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite operated as super heavy artillery that could obliterate German positions with impunity from distances that made counterfire impossible. German artillery units that attempted to engage Allied naval vessels learned the futility of their task through bitter experience. Ships moved constantly, possessed radar-directed counter-battery fire, and could call upon aircraft support within minutes of being engaged. Traditional artillery tactics, developed for static land-based targets, proved completely inadequate against naval platforms that embodied industrial warfare at its most advanced level. By July 1944, German movement during daylight hours had become virtually impossible across the entire Norman front. Allied fighter bombers, operating in cab-rank formations controlled by forward observers, could strike any target within minutes of identification. The psychological effect of this constant aerial surveillance created a form of battlefield paralysis that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The statistics documenting Allied air superiority told the story of industrial dominance in the starkest terms. Allied aircraft in theater numbered over 12,000, while German aircraft in all of France totaled between 300 and 500 operational planes. Allied daily sortie rates averaged 5,000 to 8,000 missions, while German air operations, when possible, managed 50 to 100 sorties. The mathematical impossibility of German aerial resistance became a psychological burden that affected every aspect of ground operations. The final statistics from the Normandy campaign, compiled by military historians in the decades following the war, documented the complete transformation of warfare from a contest of military skill to an industrial equation. Allied achievements from June 6 to August 30, 1944, included landing 2,052,299 personnel, 438,471 vehicles, and 3,098,259 tons of supplies, while flying over 480,000 aircraft sorties in support of ground operations. German losses during the same period revealed the mathematics of industrial warfare in human terms. 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, 2,200 tanks and assault guns lost, and over 40 divisions destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. These numbers represented more than military defeat. They documented the moment when traditional warfare concepts became obsolete in the face of industrial abundance applied to military objectives. The psychological transformation of German military thinking extended far beyond the immediate participants in the Normandy campaign. In 1954, 10 years after D-Day, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium examining the lessons of the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, delivered the keynote address that would influence military thinking for decades to come. "We learned in Normandy that warfare had changed fundamentally," Blumentritt observed. "It was no longer a contest of armies, but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production capacity. The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks, treating our most precious equipment as mere obstacles to be removed." This recognition that military superiority had become synonymous with industrial capacity would reshape German strategic thinking in the post-war era. Many Normandy veterans became advocates for European economic integration, understanding that only by pooling resources could European nations hope to match American industrial capabilities in any future conflict. Hans Speidel, Rommel's former Chief of Staff, became a NATO general and helped integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance, bringing with him the hard-learned lessons of what industrial warfare truly meant. His experience witnessing American material abundance in Normandy convinced him that future German security lay not in military prowess alone, but in economic cooperation with the very industrial powers that had overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy throughout the war, provided perhaps the most telling comparison between theaters when he addressed the Bonn Symposium in Italy. "We could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms because the terrain limited their ability to deploy their full industrial advantage. In Normandy, on open ground, where they could bring their complete material superiority to bear, our forces were simply erased from existence." This distinction highlighted a crucial lesson that would influence Cold War military planning for decades. Geography could temporarily negate industrial advantages, but only temporarily. The moment Allied forces gained access to terrain suitable for large-scale mechanized operations, German tactical expertise became irrelevant in the face of overwhelming material superiority. The long-term psychological impact of the Normandy experience extended throughout the German officer corps and fundamentally altered their understanding of modern warfare. Traditional Prussian military virtues, discipline, tactical flexibility, efficient use of limited resources, had proven insufficient against an enemy that could afford to waste resources on a scale that seemed almost criminal to German sensibilities. Major General Heinz Guderian, the father of German Blitzkrieg doctrine, spent his post-war years studying American military logistics and industrial planning. His analysis, published in Panzerleader and later military journals, acknowledged that German tactical innovations of the 1930s and early 1940s had been rendered obsolete by American industrial methods. We developed tactics to maximize the effectiveness of limited resources. They developed an industrial system that eliminated resource limitations entirely. This recognition that warfare had fundamentally shifted from tactical to industrial competitions influenced military thinking worldwide. The lessons of Normandy became required study at staff colleges across Europe, not just for their immediate tactical implications, but for what they revealed about the changing nature of military power in the industrial age. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Ohmsen returned to Crisbecq Battery as an honored guest of the Norman communities that had witnessed his baptism of fire 4 decades earlier. The former Oberleutnant Walter, now 73 years old, stood at the same concrete observation post where he had first sighted the invasion fleet that would change his understanding of warfare forever. Speaking to gathered veterans from both sides of the conflict, Ohmsen reflected on what he had witnessed that morning in 1944, 40 years ago. I stood here and saw the impossible sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told about American industrial weakness was catastrophically wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships for a single operation. Divided democracies don't coordinate such massive undertakings with such precision. His voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom as he continued. I fired my guns at that armada, and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. We sank 1 destroyer, damaged a few others, but for every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed. The mathematics were overwhelming, and mathematics don't lie. Whatever our propaganda claimed, Ohmsen's reflection captured something essential about the Normandy experience that extended beyond military history into broader questions about national power and industrial capacity. Young officers today study the tactics of D-Day, analyzing landing patterns and defensive positions. But the real lesson is simpler and more profound. In modern warfare, the side that can produce the most wins. Industrial capacity has become military capacity, and no amount of courage or tactical brilliance can overcome a 10-to-1 disadvantage in production. The sea of ships that Ohmsen had witnessed that morning represented more than an invasion fleet. It was American industrial democracy made visible, the physical manifestation of a continental economy mobilized for military purposes. The image that had haunted him for 40 years, that impossible armada stretching from horizon to horizon, embodied the future of warfare, where industrial mathematics would determine victory more decisively than battlefield heroics. The broader implications of the Normandy campaign extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The demonstration of Allied industrial superiority on June 6, 1944, marked the end of European military dominance and the beginning of an American-led international order based on industrial capacity rather than traditional military virtues. European military establishments, whether Allied or Axis, had been forged in an environment of resource scarcity where tactical excellence and efficient use of limited materials determined victory. The American approach to de-solving military problems through overwhelming application of industrial abundance represented a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare that would reshape global power relationships for generations. Soviet observers, present as liaison officers with Allied forces, took careful note of American logistical capabilities demonstrated during the Normandy campaign. Stalin's post-war military planning incorporated hard-learned lessons about the relationship between industrial production and military power, leading to massive Soviet investments in heavy industry and military manufacturing that would define Cold War competition. The psychological transformation experienced by German officers who witnessed D-Day influenced an entire generation of European military thinking. The recognition that traditional military skills had become secondary to industrial capacity led to fundamental changes in how European nations approached defense planning and international relations in the post-war era. NATO's formation in 1949 reflected these lessons, pooling the industrial resources of multiple democratic nations to match Soviet production capacity. The alliance structure acknowledged that no single European nation could maintain the industrial base necessary for independent defense. In the age of industrial warfare that D-Day had inaugurated, the German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied ships approach Normandy on June 6, 1944, witnessed more than an invasion. They witnessed the future of warfare itself. They saw industrial capacity deployed as a weapon system, production lines transformed into strategic assets, and factory workers elevated to the status of combatants in a total war economy that their traditional military education had never prepared them to understand. The image that haunted them throughout the remainder of their lives, that impossible armada stretching from horizon to horizon, represented democracy as latent power unleashed, industrial might applied to military purpose on a scale that rendered traditional concepts of warfare obsolete. They had prepared for battle against enemy soldiers. Instead, they met the full productive capacity of American democracy, and nothing in their professional experience had equipped them for such an encounter. Their defeat was not military, but mathematical, not tactical, but industrial, not a failure of courage, but an inevitable consequence of facing an enemy that could outproduce them by ratios that made resistance futile. The lesson written in steel across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, announced that American industrial might had arrived in Europe, and warfare itself would never be the same again. The ultimate legacy of D-Day extends far beyond its role in defeating Nazi Germany or ending World War II. It represents the moment when industrial capacity became the primary determinant of military power, when production statistics became more important than battle tactics, and when the ability to build ships, planes, and tanks faster than enemies could destroy them proved decisive in determining the fate of nations. For the German officers who witnessed this transformation, the memory never faded. They had seen the future of warfare with terrible clarity, a future where mathematics mattered more than heroism, where factory output determined battlefield outcomes, and where the industrial capacity of democratic nations, once fully mobilized, could overwhelm any purely military opposition, regardless of its tactical sophistication or individual courage. This was the true revelation of D-Day. Not just that the Allies could mount a successful invasion, but that they could do so with such overwhelming material superiority that German resistance became statistically insignificant. The nearly 7,000 ships that Walter Ohmsen saw through his binoculars that morning represented more than military hardware. They embodied the industrial transformation of warfare itself, the birth of a new era where productive capacity would determine the rise and fall of nations, and where the lessons learned in the waters off Normandy would shape military thinking and international relations for generations to come.